Thanks for joining us here at Service to School Stories. Service to School is a nonprofit organization providing free college admissions support to U.S. military veterans and transitioning service members pursuing undergraduate and graduate degrees, including law school, MBA programs, and medical school. Founded in 2011, Service to School was created to provide veterans with the opportunities and resources to gain admission at some of the nation's well-known academic institutions. Throughout the last 11 years, we've supported over 7,000 service members towards their educational goals. Join us as we share applicant stories, conversations, and resources that we hope you'll find helpful and inspiring in your journey towards higher education. I'm your host, Sydney Mathis, the Director of Student Success here at Service to School, former college admissions officer, and the spouse of an active duty service member. Let's dig in. Hey everyone, welcome to Season 1, Episode 1 of the Service to School Stories podcast. Today I'm joined by Hillary Browning, Navy veteran and recently admitted 1L at Yale Law School. Hillary, I'm so excited to chat with you today outside of our work responsibilities, as usually we're stuck talking about all the work stuff that we have going on, sharing the role of moms. But I'm really excited today to spend some time listening to you and about your story and how you've ended up at Yale. So thanks for joining us today, Hillary.
Thanks for having me.
Great. So let's just dive right in. Talk to me about joining the Navy. What was that like? Why did you pick the Navy? What was that experience like for you?
So I'm from Texas, and my senior year of high school, all of the seniors were asked to just like come sit in the auditorium, and we were handed the ASVAB, the military entrance test, which is pretty irregular. Usually you go to a recruiting office, you say, I would like to join the military, and they give you the test. But I guess because it's Texas, it's just like a foregone conclusion. So I took it sort of against my will. And then they sent all of our scores to the recruiters around graduation time, and I started just getting like relentless phone calls. And I'm kind of a people pleaser. And so I said, if I come in and talk to you, will you stop calling me? They're like, yeah, gladly. So yeah, got her. So I went in and I talked to the two that happened to be nearest me, which was the Navy and the Marine Corps offices. And I didn't know how to swim at the time. And so the Navy had the shorter swim requirement. And so that's the one I liked better. But I didn't like either of them. Like I wasn't going to do it.
Sure.
And they showed me a couple jobs, and I was like, no, I wouldn't even fake do any of these jobs. And then finally,
What were some of the jobs that they showed you?
Like being a yeoman, like it was like kind of like administrative secretary kind of stuff. And I was like, no thanks, I want something cool. And then they were like, how about like a parachute packer? And I was like, no thanks. And then they showed me like a couple other things, and then they were like, okay, how about this journalist one? And I was like, yeah, I'm not gonna join the Navy, but if I did, like, this is what I would do. And so I went home that night and I told my parents, who are both just like super patriotic, and they did not bat an eye. And that really angered me because like, I'm not gonna do it, but I want you to like think I'm gonna do it, I guess. So yeah. I felt very challenged. Yeah. And so I basically took it as like my dad turned and looked at me and he said, you won't do it. And I was like, oh, bet. So I went like the next day and I was like, yeah, so I'm going to sign up. How do I do this? And then they just like signed me up, and I came home and I was like, yeah, I leave in 2 months. So who won that one?
Right. What did they, or like, was there a conversation of join the Navy now that you had signed up versus go to college right away?
Well, we had been kind of talking about college because I was a senior in high school, and basically like I couldn't afford to go anywhere. I'm very debt averse. Like my mom was single for a long time when I was growing up, and we just sort of lived in like not fantastic places. And I just saw how hard it was for her to have me and then work a couple jobs and then have my sister, and my parents weren't quite together yet. And then they finally got together and got married, and it just was really hard on her. So I was very, very debt averse. So I could have gone to college and taken out loans, but I really didn't want to. Mm-hmm. So the only option was this college that was like 15 minutes down the street. And I was absolutely not entertaining that idea. I did also not want to live at home. So I was sort of stuck between like, I don't want to live with my parents anymore, but I don't want to take on loans. So the military sort of came at a perfect time. And honestly, I don't think I would have joined had it been up to me. I don't think it was even on my radar. So it's sort of great that the ASVAB was just handed to me. But yeah, college had been talked about as just sort of this like very impossible option.
Gotcha. Okay, so you'd made up your mind. You were joining the Navy. Did you get assigned to become a journalist?
I did. I like a lot of people don't know that you can sort of play hardball when you go to MEPS. And I didn't know that, but I knew that if I was going to do this thing, I was going to do the job I wanted. So I got there and they were like, "Oh, we can't do that, but we can offer you yeoman again." And I was just like, "No, I'm
Still
leaving."
no, still
And
no.
they're like, "No, no, no, don't leave." And I was like, "Okay, you promised me a job and now you're like unpromising it? Not cool, man. I'm out of here." And they were like, "Please don't leave." And so they like all huddled together and like quickly typed on a computer, like whatever. I'm sure it was all theater, but they finally were like, "Okay, we got it for you." And I was like, "Okay, great." Thank you.
That's how I feel when I like have to rebook a flight and they're like, "We have nothing," and you're like, "Okay, just keep typing because something will
Yeah, yeah.
ultimately come." Okay. So you go throughout your Navy career. I know you've had some really unique experiences in the Navy going on deployments. Talk to me about those experiences because that will ultimately come full circle and be possibly part of what we talk about with college applications, maybe.
Yeah, so I don't really remember sort of like what made me think about getting started with college classes, but my first duty station was in Japan. I did a year of training. I did an initial school and then a follow-on school, which was focused on broadcast radio. So then I went overseas and I worked at an AFN station. So for anybody in the military who's ever been overseas, you know what AFN is, and I'm sorry, and also you're welcome. So um, I worked at one of those, and we just have a lot of downtime because it's shore duty. So I went to the local college office, which ended up being Central Texas College, and I signed up for online self-paced classes. Did that for a while, and then I deployed to Afghanistan. And I stopped doing classes, and then I came back from deployment, picked them right back up. And basically, while I was in between my like military credits and doing these online classes, I finished my AA right before I separated. I did some time on a ship as well. I definitely didn't do any classes on a ship. Anybody that can juggle that is a superhero because that's really hard. But yeah, I had two sort of deployments and then classes sort of in between. So school was definitely always like a focus for me. I didn't realize at the time that I was like setting myself up to be a really competitive transfer applicant.
Mm-hmm.
I definitely didn't have that like in mind, but I was just like taking classes thinking like right now I can use tuition assistance and then use my
Right. That
GI
was
Bill
going to be
later.
my
I didn't really have a plan.
Yeah,
Yeah.
right. That was going to be my question is did you utilize tuition assistance? And then how did you know what classes to take? Was it just, well, these sound
I
interesting, or did you work with an academic advisor?
No, I mean sort of like there at the time there was like a physical guy representing CTC on base and he sort of did suggest like taking things that would be more transferable, like make sure you're taking, like an English, like a hard science, whatever. So I think I ended up taking like some gen ed stuff, like a psychology, a history, an English, things like that, just to make sure that they would be sort of competitive for a transfer later. So I did get some advice that way. Um, yeah, I think I was just like trying to fulfill CTC's gen ed requirements mostly.
Mm. For anyone who is listening that maybe is considering taking classes while they are either overseas or if there's any other opportunities, like I know when we were at Fort Carson, Pikes Peak Community College was a popular one for a bunch of soldiers. Do you have
Hmm.
any advice as far as the types of classes that are going to help them out better in the long run from your experience?
Yeah, it tends to be that online classes have a harder time transferring. That was at least my experience. So if you can take them in person, like at night or something, that would be preferable. But I know that's like hard, and sometimes you don't want to spend your only off hours then going to school. So those do transfer better though, ones that you can do in person. And then beyond that, just taking things that are just sort of universal, like taking an English, taking a history, taking a science, taking a math. There are some classes that are just really tricky to get to transfer. Like some people will take really cool stuff, right? Like they'll take the history of rock and roll, which is probably awesome and so
Right.
interesting, but the way transferring works is that the college you're transferring to has to have a similar class in order to count it. So if they don't offer the history of rock and roll, they're not going to take the class you took. So it might be fun. It might be like a fun class to be in and maybe an easy A, but it's just not going to transfer in the long run.
Right. Yeah, that's really great advice for people. Okay, so talk to me a little bit about you're enrolled at Central Texas College, just taking classes. Was the end goal there as you started taking more credits and getting further along in your education? At what point did you say, or did you at all think I'm going to finish my degree and get out, or I'm going to stay in and use these credits to either get promoted or continue on in my career in the Navy?
Yeah, I was really unsure sort of until my last like year or so in the military. I did think about like, can I chip away at an entire degree while I'm in and then maybe commission? I even once upon a time Googled like the Seaman to Admiral program the Navy has where you can like take a break and go to school while you're active duty and then come back as an officer. Um, I did sort of think about staying in and continuing it. I definitely wasn't thinking, oh, I can do this and then like transfer to like any school. Like I didn't have any sort of step-by-step plan. I wasn't like laser focused on anything, which is why it's like very wonderful that it ended up working out for me. But towards the end, like I guess I maybe had like a year and a half left, and I sort of felt like the military wasn't for me anymore. I wasn't feeling super satisfied, and I was really close to getting my AA, and I just thought like I'd rather finish school full time and not chipping away at it like this.
Sure.
Especially if I was going to be doing more sea time, it's just really difficult to go to class while you're at sea. So right at the end is when I decided to separate, and I just remember feeling really lost. Like I just would Google like veteran college application, like veteran college help, like just this series of words that was like, what do I do? Like I didn't know anyone else that was doing it because I didn't want to go back home. I didn't really have a strong desire to like go back to Texas and be near my parents, and it just didn't feel right to me. Some people have like a lovely support system and that feels really comfortable for them, but it wasn't for me. And also I had this like pretty serious boyfriend, and he was going to be getting stationed in San Diego, and so I was like kind of looking at schools in California, and I don't know, for me I just felt very lost, and so I just started kind of Googling for help, and at the time I just didn't feel like there was a ton of help for me. And then I ended up applying, unfortunately, foolishly, to some of the University of California schools. And I say foolishly because I didn't read the transfer requirements very closely. I didn't even meet like half of the transfer requirements. So they just got my application money for free.
And ran off with it.
And then just
the nice little denial alert.
And then just quickly rejected me. Yeah.
So is that like a lesson that we can take away from this, right? So you're looking at transfer requirements when you're like, okay, I want to apply, I want to get out. And then you're like, oh shoot, I just spent all of this time in class and I don't even meet these transfer requirements. Like, I think here at Service to School, that's definitely one thing that we are really excited to start to do, is to get in front of service members early enough so then they don't get in that position of
wasting. If I had really had my heart set on a UC school, if I'd really wanted to stay in California, it would have been extremely beneficial to either go to a community college in California that would have that like transfer guarantee program that they have, or to know ahead of time what does the UC system look like and what do they want to see, because they want like 2 English, 2 math, 2 sciences, and I just didn't have all of that. And so that would be something that would be like a huge bummer to learn the day that you're ready to start your transfer applications, because it's like too late. You already took all the classes that you didn't need. So yeah, that's one of those things that just kind of takes some forethought. So when I'm talking to veterans that are interested in applying to college, I always say that first. I'm like, look at the transfer requirements. Every school is different.
Yeah, that is key. Every school is different. And the UCs are incredibly cut and dry, right? Like here's what they want, here's what they're asking for. If you don't meet it, then just give us your application,
And you can't blame them. They just have such a big volume. Like the Ivies, they get a lot of applications, but not at the numbers that the UC schools are playing with. And so the Ivies can be a little more holistic and like, oh, you didn't meet this requirement, that's okay. Like, we'll wait. We don't worry about that. But the UC system is like, we have to get through 1 million applications. If you don't meet the minimum requirement, you're out of here.
Yeah. And it's the same with first year students, like the A through G requirements. I talk to applicants all the time about, do you meet the A through Gs? And one of the ones that people are always hung up on is an art class when they were in high school. Not everyone has that art requirement. So yeah. Even first year applicants like need to be very clear, especially if you're looking at engineering or any of those STEM focused fields. Like those application requirements are key. So important. Okay, so at what point did Yale end up on your radar? Because you went to Yale undergrad and now we'll go there for law school. So a true Yaley through and through. But
Yeah.
when did Yale end up on your radar? And I guess a precursor question to that would be, so you were Googling all of these words and not finding any help. When did you find help? And is that how you ended up coming across Yale?
Yeah, so I actually remember the UC applications are due usually by the end of November. And so I had already turned them in. And I was sort of just feeling I realized after I submitted them, like, I'm not gonna get in because I don't meet the requirements. So I was just sort of like waiting for them to reject me. And it was in December, and I finally like Googled the right series of words, and I found service to school, and I signed up, and I was paired with somebody like relatively quickly, and it was this guy. He was a former Ranger, and he was currently at Columbia. And he calls me, and I remember it was like snowing outside, and I'm like talking to him on the phone. I can picture I was like on my couch, and it was late at night, and he's talking to me, and he asked me like what my GPA was and what I kind of wanted to do. And finally he said like, I think you should apply to Columbia. And I sort of laughed, and I was like, no. And he said, why? And I was like, I really hate New York City. I don't want to live there. And he was like, okay, well, what about like Brown? He was like, apply to Brown. And I was like, who is this guy? Like,
Guy.
are you delusional? You sound so entitled right now. Oh yeah, I'll just apply to Brown. And I remember he just kind of was like chuckling, and he's like, I didn't think it was possible either, and he's like, the military really makes you feel like you're not special, and like I have an 18-year-old down at a recruiting station ready to replace you, and he was like, but I promise you can do it. So for the next like week or two I was underway, and I just kind of had a lot of time to think, and I thought about it, and I was like, maybe he's not crazy. And I had a unique position where I actually had internet available to me on the ship. And so I remember like late at night when my work was done, I would just like pull up these pages. I would pull up I'd pull up Brown's application page and Yale's application page and just feel so stupid. What am I doing? Like, who am I? I'm nobody. Like, nobody goes to these schools. They're not even real. And I remember my lieutenant walked by me, and he stops, and he looks at my computer, and he doesn't say anything, which was huge because in the military, like, you tease the people that you love. And he just sort of looked at it and like didn't say anything. He just like nodded his head and walked away. And I was like, I think he thinks I can do that. Like, he didn't say anything. It just felt very weird. Like, he wasn't like, Browning, what are you doing? Come on. Like, he just sort of was like, yeah, okay, yeah. And and so for me, that was like a big turning point. And I came back from the underway, and I called my ambassador, and I was like, what do we got to do?
Yeah.
And luckily I already had like a bunch of materials because I'd already applied to the UC system. And so I just cracked open the applications for Columbia because he convinced me, and Brown and Yale.
So 3 schools. When you say that you were kind of looking, researching some of these schools, what are some things that stood out to you about each of the schools, specifically that you felt would make them a good fit for you? But also, what was it like working on those essays or getting those letters of recommendation?
Yeah, I I didn't really know what to look for in terms of fit. And so the sort of attractive thing about Yale and Brown specifically is that Brown has their resumed education program, and then Yale has the Eli Whitney program, which are two programs for non-traditional students. And then Columbia has just the biggest cohort of veterans of all the Ivies. And so I was sort of ready to leave the military behind. But it's also like all I really knew, outside of high school, what else had I done besides be in the military? And so it just sort of felt safe to me to have this cohort of either veterans or people like me who didn't go to college right after high school. So I
Mm-hmm.
guess that's the kind of like fit I was looking for, was like, I just didn't want to be alone. And I've talked to some veterans who are really attracted to that idea. They're like, I really want to go to like Colgate or Williams or some of these like
Mm.
truly, truly small liberal arts colleges, and they want to be like the one veteran there, one of like 5 veterans there. They really like that idea. And I think I actually would have really liked that too. But at the time I didn't know that. I didn't even know what
Right.
college
You
fit
don't know
meant,
what
or
you
like,
don't know, right?
yeah, I didn't know what to ask myself, like,
Yeah.
what am I really looking for? I didn't know. So now that I work for S2S, those are the kinds of questions we ask veterans. Like, what are you looking for? And sometimes they don't know. And so then we prompt them, like, something to think about. Do you want to go to school with 300 veterans or with a handful? But that was kind of the thing I was looking at, was like these 3 schools with these like very clear non-traditional paths.
Yeah. And I
And
think
then
that's so
to answer
important,
your,
right?
yeah, but to answer your essay question, like writing them felt really, I don't know, like, I'm sort of a defeatist and, like, I don't think I'm special, like, imposter syndrome, just, like, raging inside me, and so
Yeah, all of
just sort
those
of,
things.
like, yeah, like, why am I even doing this? Like, who cares? Like, nobody's gonna wanna read these, like, no, like, this is not gonna be me, this is not for me. And at the time, none of those campuses really even had, like, solid websites. And, like, even on Yale's, it was like, "Here, meet 3 Eli Whitney students," and it was like, "1 is a former Olympic skater," and I was like, "Okay,
Yes,
great."
cool.
Yeah. Cool. Okay, cool. That's not me, so I guess I'll just not submit this. So it just felt really futile, and now when I talk to veterans, I hear them say the same things that I was saying. "Who am I? I'm nobody. I'm just some enlisted whatever." And it kind of breaks my heart, but also, like, makes me so happy. I've also, like, been talking to people, and they'll say, like, "Do you even know any veterans at these schools?" And I'm like, "I really do. They're real people, and they're
Yeah.
really average."
We're no, they're average.
Like, they're not Olympic skaters. Like,
Right.
what really breaks my heart is, like, I talked to a guy, he was like, "I'm just a corpsman. I'm not, like, a ranger or, like, a Navy
Right.
SEAL."
Yes.
And I'm like,
Yes.
"Me either." And thank goodness. Like, don't worry about that. Like, the schools are not just, like, here to check the Navy SEAL box. Like, you are special. You are, like, a wonderful human being who deserves to go to a good school just as much as somebody who went through a harder training program than you. So
Right.
that's something we kind of work to, like, help veterans too, is just, like, be confident and see their own value, which is I totally identify with, because even applying to law school, it was just like the same thing again. Like, who am I? I'm nobody. I'm nothing. And my husband really put it into perspective for me recently, because I was looking at somebody's bio and it said, like, MIT undergrad, Harvard Law School. And I was like, wow, that's impressive. And my husband laughed at me and he's like, "Are you joking?" And I
You
was like,
went to
"No, that's
Yale
impressive."
undergrad.
I know. And he goes, "Let me just read yours." And he was like, "Yale
Yeah, right.
undergrad, Yale Law
The
School."
law school. Yeah. I mean, come on.
And I was like,
Come on.
"Yeah, but I'm me. I'm a dork."
And I think that, so I was having a conversation with an applicant a couple weeks ago, and he's like, "I don't have any like of the big awards to put on my vet link." And I was
Right.
like, "That's totally fine." Someone reading your application file doesn't have a list of like all of the military accolades that ever could have been awarded, and they're like, "Oh, only that one?
No Purple
Next."
Heart.
Yeah, right,
Yeah.
right. Like 100% they just want to hear kind of like what you were saying, like what makes you you. And if that is, whatever award it might be, that's part of your story, right? They're not comparing your story to anyone else's story.
Yeah.
So I think that's really, really key as you're thinking about those essays too. You talked a little bit about wanting to find, that veteran community on a campus. And you ultimately ended up at Yale. Yale being one of the service to school partner schools. Can you talk to me a little bit about your undergraduate experience at Yale? Did you ever feel like the imposter syndrome went away and that you belonged on that campus? And what do you think helped that?
So the Eli Whitney program is typically about 50-50, like veterans, non-veterans, but it's all non-traditional, and it ranges in age from like 24 years old to like into the 70-year-old. We had like a couple people that were quite mature. So I really enjoyed that portion of it. Not every school has like a guaranteed cohort, but I would be willing to bet that like all the veterans on each campus find each other, or all the non-traditionals sort of find each other. But
Mm-hmm.
at Yale, it was just sort of baked into being in the Eli Whitney program. And I really enjoyed it because I could go to class and not see any other Eli Whitney students and be with all the 19 to 22-year-olds and sort of blend in, or like say that I was non-traditional if I wanted to, or not say it if I didn't. But then I sort of had this like home base to come back to, and we'd have lunches on campus, or we'd get together for a game night, and we'd be able to just sort of commiserate over like I learned about boarding schools at Yale, and I joked, I was like, "Oh yeah, the ones in Switzerland, right?" And this girl was like, "Mine's in San
No,
Diego."
Connecticut. Yeah.
I know. I was, and they're like, "There's one like a block away. What are you talking about?"
Yeah.
So just things like that, like we'd get together and be like, "Whoa!" And then another thing was like finding out that all these kids took like advanced classes in high school that like my high school
Yeah.
definitely didn't even offer. So just it was sort of nice to have this like home base of people who were like, "Yeah, this is crazy, right?" But then to be in class with all these other like wonderful, intelligent people and totally blend in if you wanted to. I was like in some clubs. I was in a secret society. Like I totally was a regular undergrad in every sense of the word. I don't, maybe this is just me because I just have a lot of like anxiety and I tend to be like very self-reflective and like maybe a little too much, but I always still felt like an imposter. Just sort of felt like a weird world that I was never going to be comfortable in. But I think that's just me. Like, I think I just wasn't comfortable even with myself. Like, I think I was like, oh, I must be sticking out right now. Oh, I must like look so old or whatever. But no one made me feel that way. I think that was more internal. And another piece of it for me was that I was the first female enlisted veteran in the Eli Whitney program ever. So I just sort of like put stress on myself as if like, you know, the classic, like if a woman messes up, you're never going to let a woman do it again. Like, so I just was sort of like, if I don't do really well, they're not going to admit any more female veterans, which I now realize is like a little egotistical, but like, it's not all about you. But there just was like a lot of pressure for a while for me to like, I really got to fit in. I really got to like make friends. But that wasn't anything that like Yale did or that the students did. And I do get more comfortable now. But it just sort of like, the imposter syndrome sort of came back as I was applying to law school.
Yeah. So let's make that leap. Talk to me a little bit about when did you decide that you wanted to go to law school?
Maybe like my second year at Yale, I realized that I was really enjoying my law focused classes and I decided to sort of like start thinking about that, but not really. Because for anybody that doesn't know, your GPA is really important when you're applying to law school. And I didn't know that. I didn't have that piece of information. And so I was still just sort of like, whatever, man, taking interesting classes that maybe were a little risky. And so it was in the back of my mind, but I was like in no way prepping for it. And then the summer before my senior year, I started studying for the LSAT and I was going to take it. And then I found out that I was pregnant with my first child. And so all of a sudden, like, I can't go to law school. I'm going to have a baby. And so I completely stopped. And then my husband separated from the Navy and he was going to be doing class while I was doing like just community college while I was doing my senior year. And we didn't think we could float it. Like the debt that comes with law school, two of us being students, like somebody has to work. So we just figured like, I'll graduate, I'll get a job and he'll go to school. And then we sort of like did the math with like disability and BAH payments. And we're like, I think we actually can float it. So all of a sudden it was like turned back on. And then I found out I was pregnant again. So I did end up applying last cycle for the fall 2021 cycle. I did end up applying just to Yale Law School because we still live in New Haven. And I was waitlisted, which ended up being completely fine because I would have had a 12-week-old baby at home, which is to say not ideal. So that was like my first crack at it. And I really struggled with like the essays and what to write about and what to focus on and sort of like wrestling a lot about with like my therapist and stuff. And he was asking me like, what are you wrestling with? And I was just like, do I really still have to keep doing this veteran thing? Like that doesn't feel like I am more than just 6 years of service. Like that's not who I am in totality. And I just really wrestled with like how much to lean on it. And finally he just sort of like snapped me out of it. And he was saying like, it's not the same as being like, I was student debate club president. Like they did that for a semester or a year. He's like, you gave 6 years of your life to something big, like write about it. Like let it be a big check in a box for them. And also like, who cares if that's why they're taking a second look at you because you meet some sort of like veteran quota they might want to meet. Like who cares? Like be the veteran that they're looking at,
Sure.
And I have talked to some applicants who kind of feel the same way. Like, what can I write about this other thing? And I ended up going to a Yale Law School like application webinar, and the dean basically said, the dean of admissions, she was like, write about it because it's only gonna like look good for you. It's only gonna make us feel good. Like we want to admit veterans, so don't like beat around the bush about it. Write about it. Yeah. But it did even having gone through an application process already, even having gotten into Yale, like I was still feeling a lot of imposter syndrome and just very weird about like what to write and what to emphasize. And I wish I'd maybe emphasized like being a female enlisted veteran a little bit more, but okay. I did end up writing about my service. Yeah.
So talking a little bit about like owning that either identity or that story, what would you say to someone who is starting to write either their law school essay or the undergraduate essays and trying to figure out kind of like, is that worth it to write about?
I mean, it's always worth it to write about. With undergraduate essays, you tend to get like a handful of essays. So you can sort of put it into just one of them. You can talk about it across multiple. With law school, sometimes you just get the personal statement. And so you sort of have to put it in there. And I would say, like, write about it, one, if you're comfortable writing about it, but two, like, your essays they should be like crafted. They should often have like a story arc to them, like a point to them. So if there's no like clear point, then you don't really need to write about it. It's going to be in your resume. You can add it as like a diversity statement or as an addendum if it doesn't fit naturally into your main essay or your main personal statement. But it's definitely something that you don't want to just like leave unspoken. You definitely want to talk about it. You want to mention it. You want to tell them what you did, because it's double, right? Like, yes, they're looking at you because you're a veteran, but it's also your work experience. And everyone else is probably writing about jobs that they've had. So why wouldn't you write about the job that you had?
Yeah. And I think that is a really great way to look at it. Especially when I'm talking to our first year applicants and I'm like, hey, look, the high school students have this entire application that allows them to explain the activities that they were involved in, student government, debate, or whatever. But this is your opportunity to explain that same experience, but just from an adult learner perspective. And I think using either the VetLink addendum or working with Service to School to help make that translation and to make that, jump in either your story or your experiences and how they can translate into an academic environment is just wildly useful to an admissions committee because, like you said, they don't know what it's like to be in the military, right? Like they don't know what jobs you've had the last 6 years. So using that essay as a place to share your lived experiences, whatever they might have been,
Right.
I think is just such a key takeaway.
And I think too, like I talked to an applicant recently who had this really interesting story, like came from a different country, learned English in this very interesting way. Like he had other parts of his life that he felt required more explanation and more emphasis than his military portion, which is totally fine. So his main essay didn't focus on that. It focused on other parts of his life. And then just as an addendum, as a diversity statement, he talked about his reasons for joining the military. And that's totally fine too. Like it's important, and as long as you mention it, that's great, because you don't just want to write veteran and then move on, because they're going to be curious, like, well, what did you do? So you just want to get out in front of it and tell them, here's what I did, here's all of me.
Absolutely.
For me, I got lucky. Like I sort of had one thing that like a lot of, I mean, you could speak to this as like a professional in the admissions world, but like what we always hear is like a cohesive package, right? Like, so I sort of got lucky and I had this through line. I've already mentioned it, like financial insecurity was a really big thing for me. And so like one of my main reasons for joining the military was this debt aversion, this financial insecurity, because the military was a guaranteed paycheck. It was college tuition. And so that's why I did that. And then I used my GI Bill, and that felt very safe. And then applying to law school, I'm interested in tax law. So for me, it was sort of all connected. It was like growing up a certain way informed my desire to like be financially stable, which informed my decision to join the military, which then informed my interest in tax law. So for me, it was sort of all connected, but that doesn't have to be the case. There doesn't have to be this like straight linear path from high school to military to work experience, either before or after to school.
Yeah. And I think when you can make that arc, it's great. But not everyone knows, especially like you were saying, when you were taking those classes at Central Texas College, like you probably had no idea at that point that you were, going to end up at Yale Law School.
Oh yeah, definitely not.
But I think smart of you to look back and kind of see how that was all culminating now to where you're at. But I do feel like we talk to a lot of applicants a lot that are like, oh, well, I studied political science and now I want to go into computer engineering and none of this makes sense. Or when their, MOS is entirely different from what they want to study and they're trying to make that leap. I think as long as you can articulate that in your essays and help them understand why it's an interest of yours now, that's, one of the best ways to use that essay space. But
yeah, absolutely. I've always sort of said to like, don't leave anything up to the admissions committee to imply, even if it feels very obvious to you.
Yeah.
You just always want to get out in front of it and explain it, like poor grades. And like you said, like going from seemingly like one interest to another, that's, 180, like just over explain if you can. Because one thing too, like whenever if people use S2S and they have an ambassador, like my favorite is to get an essay that's sort of like over the word count, because I can always trim down. But it's hard for me because I don't know your whole story to then like interject and say like, well, why don't you write about this thing from your childhood here? Because I don't know it. And so for me, it's always better like over explain and then trim down from there.
Absolutely. Did you use service to school for law school?
Yeah. So the first time I applied, the year I got waitlisted, I did. I sort of again like was really late to the process. And for law school, that's not ideal because it tends to be rolling admissions, with the exception of Yale. They say it doesn't matter when you apply. So I basically applied like a week before the deadline. And I reached out to Service to School, and they connected me with a current YLF student who helped me sort of edit my personal statement and my like Yale supplemental essay. And he is the one that told me write a diversity statement. And I was like, I don't need to write a diversity statement. Like, I'm coming from an Ivy undergrad. Like, that doesn't feel like that's for me. And he's like, write a diversity statement. Like, veterans should write one. And so I was like, oh, okay. And he's right. Like, veterans should write one. I also have a couple other things like growing up. I mean, I am FGLI, like first generation low income. I was low income when I was growing up. And then I'm a first generation undergrad and graduate student. And I'm a veteran and I'm a mom. Like, there's just a lot of boxes I'm checking that should require a diversity statement. So that was really helpful. And he also just sort of like gave me the confidence of like reading my personal statement. It's like helpful to have someone who's doing the thing that you want to do, sort of look at what you're doing and like affirm it and validate it and be like, yeah, this is good. You're going in the right direction. You're doing the right thing. Especially because applying to undergrad, I just felt so lost. So it was just really nice to just have someone be like, yeah, everything looks good. All the boxes are getting checked. Like, you're okay. And then I was actually very pleasantly surprised to get waitlisted the first time, because I didn't think my numbers were where they needed to be. Again, I was feeling very, undeserving. And so I was very shocked to get waitlisted. And it's sort of what buoyed me to apply again the next year.
Yeah, so talking a little bit about, getting waitlisted that first time, and sometimes those unfortunate decisions can just be a redirect. So everything will work out if you're waitlisted, kind of how it did in your situation, right? Where it probably wasn't the best opportunity or the best time for you to do law school with a 12-week-old. But also looking at sometimes, denials are the same way, where it can feel like that's, a door closing, but in reality, maybe it's a door opening for another really great opportunity, or, like your situation, another opportunity to reapply and give the process a little bit more thought and, figure out some things that you could do differently in your application the second time, which leads me to my second question, or my next question, I guess. What did you do differently when you reapplied to Yale Law School?
So I attended a waitlist seminar that Yale Law School offered once they put you on the wait list. And basically the dean of admissions said, like, if you were waitlisted, that means that your application was really, really close. So don't go making like these big sweeping changes. Like, you don't need to just like revamp everything. Like, you were really close. So to anyone who gets put on a wait list and doesn't get admitted anywhere and has to reapply another cycle, just kind of keep that in mind. Like, you don't need to go in and restructure everything. Maybe just sort of like retool a little bit, or see if your essay could be a little stronger, or if you have to do test scores, like ask yourself if you want to retest. So for me, I tried to like, I didn't have that cohesive sort of through line that I had the first time. So I went through and sort of like really zeroed in on like tax policy. I wrote my Yale supplemental essay on tax policy. I just tried to really hit the like cohesive part a little harder. I reused my exact same letters of recommendation. My personal statement, like skeleton, was still pretty much the same. So really, I think it was more just like right time, and then just making my essays a little bit stronger. And it worked out for me. Although like it worked out for me eventually, but I submitted my applications in early November. I submitted them on Veterans Day, and I just sat around waiting. And my first admissions decision was UT Austin, and they rejected me. And I was like, okay, cool. And then
this is a great start.
And then my second decision was I applied to a fellowship in conjunction with Stanford Law School. I applied to the Knight Hennessy scholarship, and I didn't get that. So I didn't get the scholarship. And then my third decision was I got waitlisted at Harvard Law School, and I was like, this doesn't feel good. So now I'm holding out hope for the top two law schools in the nation, Yale and Stanford. And that felt really kind of bad. And I just sort of saw like, I thought like, I'm probably going to get waitlisted again. Best case scenario, right? Like I'm going to get waitlisted again at Yale and maybe at Stanford or outright rejected. So I started like really thinking about retaking the LSAT, trying to like boost my score because my GPA is set in stone, but I can boost my LSAT. So I started studying again. Like I was really just sort of like, okay, I'm going to apply for a third cycle. It's okay. And then I got the call very, very, very late March, like March 28th or something, that I had been admitted to Yale Law School. And like that day, I sent an email to Stanford being like, no thanks.
No thanks.
And so I rejected Stanford. But so I withdrew. But like, yeah, it felt really bad. It felt really bad to have sort of like these 3 rejections essentially like sitting on my lap, and my husband was sort of checking on me like, how you doing? And I'm like, not good. This does not feel good. And it's really hard for a lot of people, I'm sure, but like for me it's really hard to not take that personally.
Sure.
Even though I know that for Yale admissions, like it's sort of, or for law school admissions, it's sort of like a numbers game. Like it felt hard to not be like, man, they must not like me, you know? Like, and I really tried not to go there because that's it. You really shouldn't take it that personally because there's a lot of stuff happening behind the admissions scene. Like maybe you can speak to this, but like admissions offices, they have like metrics they're trying to hit. They're trying to build out like a class that makes sense. Like they're also looking at class fit. And so it's not always like it's not you suck. It's like the school has certain needs and maybe you don't fit that need this year. And I think that's what happened the year prior at Yale Law School. So it felt really crummy. And then obviously it felt really great, right, when I had been admitted. So it obviously worked out for me, but I definitely know like it still hurt to get those 2 UC rejections, you know, even though I knew they were coming, it still hurt. And I remember I was waiting for all my like undergraduate decisions to come in. And I remember I was like playing a card game with my husband and I lost the card game and I broke down crying. And he was like, what is happening? Like, this is an absurd reaction for a card game. And I just like looked at him and I said, what if I don't get in anywhere? Like, what if I'm rejected everywhere? And I just, at that moment, he could just tell like I had been carrying this around. And so I get really stressed out working at service to school, like during decision season, because I just know that feeling of just waiting and waiting and waiting. And I submitted my Yale Law School applications in November and I didn't get admitted till March 28th. So just for like 5 months, I'm walking around like feeling so bad. So I definitely know the feeling of just being really like defeated and thinking it's you and there's something wrong with you. And it's really hard. But I've done 3 application cycles now. So, you know, I'm definitely like no stranger to it. And you just have to, sometimes you do have to, they call it, you know, R&R, rest and reapply. Sometimes you do have to, and it might end up working out for you better than you could have imagined.
Yeah. Oh, beautiful. And that's just like I was just saying, right? When one door closes, right, you've got all of those denials the second time and just like feeling so bummed about it. And then this incredible door swings wide open and you know, a incredible opportunity for you, but also for your family. You know, it's just like, chef's kiss. I love it.
Well, that's like speaking of the family though, like that was also sort of a heavy piece was like, if I don't get into law school, like what are we going to do? Like I can be sort of alarmist, you know? So I was like, once again, like kind of like being the first female enlisted at Yale undergrad, like I was sort of like putting all this pressure on myself that my family was not putting on me. But I could totally foresee some veterans out there, especially if they're older and they have kids and, you know, they're like, I'm going to go to school and I'm not going to be working. Like, school's an investment. So like you're going to go to school so that you can get better jobs after school. And I know that can be scary. We work with a lot of enlisted veterans who are older and have families. And I know for them, that's sort of always scary too. So I was definitely feeling a lot of that. Like my family needs me to get into law school, which I know can be stressful. So I just think sometimes like it can be helpful, at least for me, like it was helpful to be working with service to school and have an ambassador, just have somebody there who's doing the thing that you want to do, just saying like you're doing everything right, like your applications look good, the essay looks good, like just to sort of have somebody on your side saying like you can do this. I think that's really helpful, especially if your family, if you are first generation and your family doesn't really get it, or if you don't know anybody else who's ever gone through a non-traditional application process, it can feel very lonely and confusing. So that was really helpful for me, was just to have someone to sort of like calm me down and say like, you got it, everything's, you know, you're like checking all the boxes, everything's good, it's going to be okay.
Yeah. And there's so much of this process that is within your control as the applicant. But there's also, like you were saying earlier, about institutional priorities, there's a bit of the process that's outside of your control. And I do think that ambassador relationship is just so important to help you keep grounded on the things that you can control, right? Like the stories that we talked about, the schools that you apply to, the programs that you're interested in, and then letting the parts of the process that you can't control, just kind of let it be. But absolutely, being true and honest to who you are throughout the process, keeping that central, I think helps take a lot of the stress out of, the larger picture of, am I enough? I need this for my family, right? And just saying, I'm going to do what I can do and control that narrative as best as I can, and working with an ambassador, working with service to school to help, craft that story. That's, the biggest, I think, benefit to the process is walking away and feeling like you quote unquote, laid it all out there.
Yeah, so, definitely.
Hillary, as we wrap up, what would you say has been the biggest lesson that you've taken either from your entire college application, college experience, but also from, now going into Yale Law School, studying exactly what you want to do? Like, what are you looking forward to the most? So looking back and looking forward.
Yeah. For me, like something that was really helpful in getting over my imposter syndrome was becoming a service to school ambassador, and then eventually like working at service to school, because it felt like I was sort of like earning my place almost. Like I felt really undeserving of Yale admitting me. I was just like, I'm so grateful to be here, and they didn't have to do this, they didn't have to smile upon me. Like, and so for me, like getting over feeling like an imposter was just sort of paying it forward. So every time I would talk to a veteran that would just feel like a Yale, a Brown, or even just like their dream school, like somebody's dream school was UC Irvine for equine science. And for her, like it just seemed unimaginable to go there. And I'm like, yeah, girl, get it. Like I will help you apply. And so for me, like paying it forward and just like being that support system for another veteran like I had has just made me feel so much better. I really get like stressed with the applicants that I work with. I get stressed when they turn things in. I know they're waiting for results, and when they get in, I get really excited for them. And if they get waitlisted or rejected, like I know that feeling too. But it just sort of helps me like just get over feeling like an imposter. And then looking forward, I'm sort of excited to keep doing that, because I asked the Yale Law School admissions office if I'm the first female enlisted veteran they've had. And they sort of said like that they hadn't looked it up, but they know that I'm the first one in at least like 20 or 30 years. So, which kind of leads me to believe like I'm probably the first one.
The only one.
Yeah. So like and while I feel sort of like undeserving, like, oh, it shouldn't be me that's like carrying this title, I'm also sort of like, well, somebody has to do it. And so I'm really excited to do what I've been doing on the undergrad side, like for the law school side. Like a lot of law school admissions is really officer heavy. So just encouraging more enlisted veterans, like, hey, I know you have a big stretch of road in front of you. Like you have to get into undergrad, finish undergrad, and then apply to law school. But just sort of like being that person for people to go like, okay, it is possible. And there is someone at the school doing it, and I can do it too.
Yes. Well, there you have it, from small town Texas to Yale Law School. Man, Hillary, thank you so much for being vulnerable and having this conversation and talking about the ups and downs of your process. I think it's so important for our listeners to know that your story is your own, but it certainly isn't an isolated experience. That veterans are being admitted to top colleges, top universities across the country, and at increasingly higher numbers each year. Here at Service to School, we're seeing more and more veterans entering the classroom at some of the best schools in the country. So so excited for the work that you are about to go on in your journey at Yale Law School. We will absolutely miss you here at Service to School, but I know you'll continue to be around as an ambassador and supporting veterans in their journey towards higher education. But for anyone who isn't currently working with Service to School, we are a nonprofit organization providing free college admission support to undergraduate students all the way up through PhD programs, including med school, law school, and MBA programs. So if you aren't working with us, go ahead and sign up on our website. Thank you all for spending some time with us today as we chat with Hillary. Hillary, thank you again so much, and we'll see you all around on the Service to School podcast.
That's it for this episode. Join us next week, same time, same place, where we share more Service to School stories. Service to School Stories is hosted by Sydney Mathis, the Director of Student Success, and produced by Amanda DeBias, the Director of Communication at Service to School. Service to School is a 501c3 nonprofit providing free college admission support to transitioning service members and veterans. Join us next time and follow us for more on all of your favorite social media platforms.